Hey guys, Professor Schubeck here back today with another video. Today, we're going to be talking about deductive, inductive, and suppositional strengths when referring to arguments. We've all been in arguments before, but what does it really mean to break it apart, and how do we differentiate a certain argument from another and see what is really going down? Let's talk about that. I'm going to start with deductive validity. Deductive validity is basically a case where the premises entail the conclusion. So whenever we're making arguments, right, the ultimate point that we're getting at, we're basing that off of premises or facts or evidence that we're giving, which are known as our premises. That might be a little confusing, so let's run through an example of where the premises entail the conclusion. So let's assume that Josh writes with his left hand. If Josh writes with his left hand, then he lives in New Jersey. And we also will use a premise, Josh writes with his left hand. Based on these two premises, we draw the conclusion, Josh lives in New Jersey. Now, this is a deductive valid argument because if Josh writes with his left hand, is always true, and if Josh writes with his left hand and then he lives in Jersey is always true, then every single time that these two premises are true, Josh will always live in New Jersey. It is impossible for the conclusion to be true if the premises in this case are false, and that's what makes it deductively valid. Arguments that follow this structure that are intended to be deductively valid, we call deductive arguments because they deduce the conclusion. Now, what happens if an argument supports your conclusion but isn't fully deductive, meaning it's not always the case that that's true, but we use premises that make the case more likely, right? Because in real life, not everything can be as binary as it's not or it is. Sometimes it's in between as maybe it is, maybe it's not, but as information and premises and research is gathered and uploaded and included, you start to see that it's more likely to be something, but never 100%. Where do we go with that? Well, there's something called suppositional strength. With suppositional strength, we have the premises make the conclusion probable. Now, unlike before with deductive validity, if the premises were true, the conclusion is always true. In this case, if the premises are true, the conclusion is more likely to be true. But it's not impossible to have a true conclusion if the premises are true. If you're a little shaky, let's go through an example. So let's repeat the same one, but the only difference is I added most likely. Let me read you through it. If Josh writes with his left hand, then he most likely lives in New Jersey. Josh writes with his left hand, we conclude Josh lives in New Jersey. Now, how is this different? Although the only difference is the first premise says most likely instead of definitely lives in Jersey, that makes a big deal because before in the deductive valid argument, if it definitely means if he writes with his left hand, then he lives in New Jersey, we know for sure when that premise he's left-handed is true, he definitely lives in New Jersey. There is no way for him to live in New Jersey if he's not left-handed, if that's the premise that is true. In this case, because we're saying that if Josh writes with his left hand, he will most likely live in New Jersey, that means he does not necessarily, even if that's a 99% chance that he lives in New Jersey, there's still a 1% chance that he doesn't. So if these two conclusions, premises are true, that he writes with the left hand and he most likely lives in New Jersey, and he writes with his left hand, it is acceptable to assume that he lives in New Jersey because it's most likely the case. However, because it is possible he does not, even with these premises are true, this is known as suppositional strength, meaning this argument is not deductively valid, but it does provide evidence that makes it more than likely for this conclusion to be true, given that the premises are true. Arguments that set out to do this, meaning they set out to make it more likely and not deductively valid. So arguments that set out to do this and are not intended to be deductively valid, we are called inductive arguments. So to recap it all, we have deductive validity, where the premises entail the conclusion. If the premises are true, the conclusion is always true. There is no way for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true. In suppositional strength, we have arguments where the premises make the conclusion more probable. So it is more than likely the conclusion is true if the premises are true, but it is not impossible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true in suppositional strength. Arguments that set out to be deductively valid are called deductive arguments. Arguments that use suppositional strength and set out to make the conclusion more probable are known as inductive arguments. I hope that helps. One thing I will mention is in this brief example of suppositional strength, it's not fully detailed, but for all intents and purposes, I'm hoping to give you a general example of what that means. And to go further into that, we could have questions or answers in the YouTube comments, and we can go a little deeper in a future video. But the point of this video was to ensure that you know the difference between deductive and inductive arguments, what deductive validity is, and what suppositional strength is. Thank you all for watching. If you like this video, please like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one.